The fluorescent lights of the high-security data wing hummed with a low, clinical buzz that seemed to get under Lena's skin. It was her third week at the agency, and so far, her primary contribution had been staying out of everyone's way. The air in the room was cold, kept at a precise temperature to prevent the stacks of black servers from overheating, but the atmosphere among the staff was even chillier. Lena sat at Terminal 14, the one furthest from the coffee machine and the closest to the emergency exit. She was 24, with a quiet face and a habit of tucking her hair behind her ears when she was nervous. To the veterans in the room, she was a diversity hire or a space filler. They didn't see the years she'd spent in windowless rooms winning international coding competitions. They only saw her oversized sweater and her silence. Directly across from her sat Robert. Robert had been with the agency for 20 years and never let anyone forget it. He wore short-sleeved button-down shirts and had a laugh that sounded like gravel grinding together. Beside him was Jackson, a man who spent more time leaning back in his ergonomic chair talking about his weekend golf scores than actually looking at the scrolling green lines on his monitor. "Hey, rookie," Robert called out, not looking up from his screen. "The system is running a bit sluggish on the Tier 4 intake. Why don't you run a basic clearance scrub? It'll give you something to do besides staring at the wall." Jackson chuckled. "Careful, Rob. You give her a scrub to do, and she might accidentally delete the whole firewall. Maybe we should start her on something simpler, like checking if the mice are plugged in." Lena felt the heat rise in her neck. She didn't look at them. Instead, she just nodded and pulled up the interface for the scrub. "I'll get on it," she said softly. Her voice was steady, even if her heart was racing. The scrub was a tedious, mind-numbing task. It involved cross-referencing thousands of incoming digital signatures against a database of known, safe identities. It was the digital equivalent of checking ID cards at a gate. For an hour, the room was filled with the sound of rapid typing and the occasional clink of a ceramic mug. Robert and Jackson continued their banter, their voices echoing in the sterile room. They talked over Lena as if she were a piece of office furniture. They discussed the upcoming promotion cycle and how the new generation lacked the grit to handle real pressure. "Everything today is automated," Robert complained, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. "Back in my day, we had to spot the anomalies by eye. Now these kids just click a button and hope the software does the work for them. No instinct, no soul." Lena ignored the jab. She was deep into the third layer of the scrub when something caught her eye. It wasn't a red flag. The system wasn't screaming at her. In fact, the system had already marked the packet as safe. It was a small 3-kilobyte file embedded in a routine update from a satellite office in Singapore. Most people would have scrolled past it. It looked like a standard metadata tag, a bit of digital dust that often gets stuck to larger files. But Lena noticed a rhythm in the code. It wasn't random. It was a sequence of prime numbers hidden in the hexadecimal string. She paused. Her mouse hovered over the clear button, but she didn't click it. She opened a sub-window and began to pull the thread. "What's the holdup, kid?" Jackson asked, rolling his chair over. He looked at her screen and snorted. "You're stuck on a metadata tag. Just hit bypass. We've got a backlog of 3,000 files because you're playing detective on a ghost." "Something doesn't look right," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course it doesn't look right to you. You've been here 20 minutes. Robert chimed in, joining Jackson behind her. They stood like two giants over her shoulder, the shadows falling across her keyboard. "That's a sync tag from Singapore. We get 10,000 of those a day. It's a glitch in their legacy software. We've known about it for months. Just bypass it and move on." "It's not a glitch," Lena said, a bit firmer this time. "The math is too perfect. Glitches are messy. This is intentional." Robert groaned, a long, dramatic sound of frustration. Listen to me. I've been doing this since before you had a social media account. You're stalling the entire department's workflow because you think you found a prissy piece of code. This is a secure government facility, not an art gallery. Clear the check. Now. Lena looked at the screen. She knew that if she cleared it, the file would vanish into the main server, where it would be distributed to every computer in the building. If she was wrong, she would be the girl who cried wolf and probably lose her job by Monday. But if she was right, I can't, she said. The room went quiet. Even the people at the far end of the office turned around. No one told Robert no. Excuse me? Robert's voice dropped an octave. It was a dangerous, low tone. I'm not clearing it until I run a deep structure analysis, Lena said. Her hands were shaking under the desk, but she kept her eyes fixed on the monitor. Jackson let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She wants to run a deep structure on a sync tag. Unbelievable. Rob, she's actually serious. She thinks she's found something the automated filters missed. The filters that cost the taxpayers $40 million. It's cute, really, Robert said, though his face was red with anger. The arrogance of the youth. You think you're smarter than the machine? You think you're smarter than the machine? You think you're smarter than us? Fine. You want to play? Go ahead. Run your analysis. But know this. When that comes back as a null error, I'm going to personally write the memo for your dismissal. You're wasting agency time, and I don't tolerate ego. He stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest. Jackson leaned against a filing cabinet, a smug grin on his face. They were waiting for her to fail. They were enjoying it. They wanted to see the moment the screen confirmed her mistake so they could finally push her out of their inner circle. Lena didn't say another word. She turned back to the terminal. She felt the eyes of the entire room on her back. She began to type, her fingers moving with a speed and precision she hadn't shown them before. She wasn't just clicking buttons anymore. She was writing a custom script on the fly to peel back the layers of the file. The progress bar appeared on the screen, analyzing 10%, 20%. Any second now, Jackson whispered loudly. Any second, it's going to pop up, clear, and then we can all go back to our lives. Lena didn't blink. She watched the code unravel. Beneath the safe tag, beneath the Singapore timestamp, something dark and complex was starting to emerge. It was like watching a beautiful painting being scraped away to reveal a hidden, terrifying message underneath. The progress bar hit 90%. Robert leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale coffee. He was ready to pounce. He had his hand on the back of her chair, ready to pull her away from the desk the moment the word normal appeared. The bar hit 100%. The screen didn't show normal. It didn't show null error. Suddenly, the standard blue interface of the agency software flickered. The screen went black for a heartbeat, and then a single, sharp image began to render in the center of the display. As the pixels filled in, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The mocking smiles vanished. Jackson's grin froze and then melted into a look of pure confusion. Robert, who had been leaning forward to berate her, suddenly stiffened, his hand dropping from her chair as if it had been burned. On the screen, a symbol was forming. It wasn't a logo any of them recognized from the database. It was something older, something that carried a weight none of them were prepared for. The room, which had been filled with noise and insults just moments ago, fell into a silence so heavy you could hear the clock on the far wall ticking. Lena sat perfectly still, her eyes reflecting the strange, glowing light of the symbol that had just silenced the room. The silence in the room was no longer the awkward quiet of a disagreement. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a car crash. Everyone was frozen, staring at the monitor on Terminal 14. The symbol on the screen was glowing a soft, pulse-like violet. It looked like a stylized eye wrapped in a series of interlocking triangles. It was elegant, ancient-looking, and completely out of place in a room filled with modern government hardware. Robert was the first to move, though he didn't speak. He leaned in so close to the screen that the purple light reflected in his glasses. His face, which had been flushed with anger just moments ago, was now a pale, sickly shade of gray. He reached out as if to touch the monitor, then pulled his hand back quickly, like a child warned of a hot stove. "What is that?" Jackson finally whispered. The smugness was gone from his voice, replaced by a thin, shaky tone. "Is that part of the Singapore file? Is it a virus?" Lina didn't answer immediately. Her fingers were still hovering over the keys, but she wasn't typing. She was reading the strings of data that were now cascading down the side of the symbol. Unlike the standard code they used every day, this was written in a language that seemed to bridge the gap between mathematics and art. It was beautiful, but she knew that in this building, beauty usually meant danger. "It's not just a virus," Lina said, her voice sounding much older than it had 5 minutes ago. "It's a handshake. This symbol isn't a glitch. It's a signature. It's telling the server that it has permission to be here. The reason the system marked it as safe is because this code is written to look like the agency's own heartbeat." Robert finally found his voice, though it was cracked. "That's impossible. Our encryption is updated every hour. Nobody can mimic our heartbeat, not the Russians, not the private cartels. Nobody." "Someone did," Lina replied. She finally looked up at him. She didn't look smug or triumphant. She looked worried. "And they didn't do it by cracking our code. They did it by being part of it. This isn't an outside attack, Robert. This is an in-station." The weight of that statement hit the room like a physical blow. If what the girl was saying was true, the security of the entire building and everything stored within it was a lie. Jackson started pacing back and forth in the narrow aisle between the terminals. "We need to pull the plug. Right now. Kill the power to the whole sector. If that thing starts talking to the main server, we're finished." "No!" Lina shouted, her voice cutting through Jackson's panic. It was the first time she had raised her voice, and it stopped him in his tracks. "If you kill the power now, the file has a self-destruct trigger. I can see it in the sublines. If the connection is severed abruptly, it will wipe every drive in this room. We'll lose everything, and we'll never know who sent it or what they took." "So what do we do?" Robert asked. He was no longer standing over her like a superior. He was standing beside her, looking at her as if she were a lifeline. The veteran, with 20 years of experience, was asking the rookie for directions. "I have to isolate it," Lina said, turning back to the screen. "I need to build a digital cage around it. I'll trick the file into thinking it's still connected to the main server, but I'll actually be routing it into a dead-end loop. But I need time, and I need silence." Robert turned to the rest of the room. A small crowd of analysts had gathered, some standing on their tiptoes to see over the partitions. "Everyone back to your stations," he barked, though the usual bite in his voice was replaced by a sense of urgency. "Jackson, get on the internal line. Call the director's office. Don't tell them we have a breach. Yet just tell them we have a Category Purple anomaly at Terminal 14, and we need the floor locked down." As the room scrambled into motion, the atmosphere shifted from mockery to a high-stakes operation. The very people who had spent the morning making fun of Lina's sweater were now scurrying to follow the orders that indirectly came from her discovery. Lina blocked out the noise. She began to type, a steady, rhythmic sound that became the heartbeat of the room. She was working in a sandbox, a private area of the computer where she could experiment without risking the rest of the network. She began to build the cage. It was like a high-speed game of chess. Every time she moved to block a piece of the code, the violet symbol would pulse and the code would shift, trying to find a new way out. It was reacting to her. It was as if someone or something on the other end was watching her work in real time. "It's fighting back," she muttered, sweat beginning to bead on her forehead. "What do you mean?" Robert asked, leaning against the desk. He was trying to stay calm for her sake, but his hands were buried deep in his pockets to hide the fact that they were shaking. "The code," she explained, her eyes darting across the monitor. "It's adaptive. Every time I build a wall, it finds a crack I didn't even know existed. It knows this system better than we do. It's using our own security protocols to hide from my cage." Suddenly, the violet symbol on the screen began to grow. It expanded until it filled the entire monitor, and then the internal speakers of the computer let out a low, humming tone. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was deep enough to vibrate the pens on the desk. On the screen, letters began to appear beneath the symbol. They weren't in English. They weren't even in a standard alphabet. They looked like a mix of ancient runes and modern binary. "Can you read that?" Jackson asked, having returned from his phone call. "Is that a threat?" Lena squinted at the characters. She felt a strange sense of recognition. She had seen shapes like this before, in the back of old textbooks on the history of cryptography, long before computers were even invented. "It's a question," she said softly. "A question," Robert huffed. "A computer program doesn't ask questions. It's a machine." "This isn't a machine," Lena replied, her fingers slowing down. "This is a message. It says, 'Are you the one we were waiting for?'" The room went cold again. The idea that a piece of malicious software was specifically looking for a person, not a file, not a password, but a person, was terrifying. Before Robert could respond, the doors at the end of the hall hissed open. A tall man in a dark, perfectly tailored suit walked in. He didn't look like a tech expert. He looked like a general. This was the director of security, a man whose name was rarely spoken and whose presence usually meant someone was being escorted out of the building in handcuffs. He walked straight to Terminal 14, ignoring Robert and Jackson entirely. He stood behind Lena and looked at the violet symbol. He didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. "How long has it been since the symbol appeared?" the director asked. His voice was like ice. "6 minutes, sir," Robert stammered. "We were just about to—" "I wasn't asking you," the director cut him off. He looked down at Lena. "Did you clear the check or did you hold it?" Lena looked the most powerful man in the building in the eye. "I held it. They told me to bypass, but I refused." The director nodded slowly. He looked at the violet eye on the screen, which seemed to pulse in time with his breathing. "Good, because if you had clicked clear, this building would have been a hollow shell by noon." He turned to Robert and Jackson, his eyes narrowing. "You two, leave your badges on the desk. You're being reassigned to the basement archives, effective immediately." "Sir?" Jackson gasped. "We were just following standard protocol." "The girl was the one stalling the workflow. The girl," the director said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "just saved your lives. Now get out before I have security assist you." As the two veterans slunk away, defeated and silent, the director turned back to Lena. He pulled a small silver key from his pocket and held it out to her. "The symbol on your screen hasn't been seen in 30 years, he said. "It belongs to a group we thought was a myth, and they've just asked you a question. I think it's time you gave them an answer." Lena looked at the silver key, then back at the pulsing violet eye. The routine morning she had expected was over. The life she knew was over. She reached out and took the key. The director's hand stayed steady as he held the silver key toward Lena. Around them, the high-tech hum of the office seemed to fade into a dull, distant murmur. The departure of Robert and Jackson had left a vacuum of power at the desk, and for the first time since she had walked through the heavy front doors of the agency, Lena felt like she was actually being seen. "That key doesn't open a door," the director said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "It opens a bridge. Follow me." Lena stood up, her legs feeling a bit like jelly. She took one last look at her monitor. The violet eye was still there, watching, waiting. She grabbed her bag and followed the director through the maze of cubicles. They didn't head toward the main elevators. Instead, they walked toward a nondescript service closet near the back of the server farm. Inside the closet, the director pushed aside a stack of old monitors to reveal a small hidden terminal built directly into the wall. It looked decades old, with a chunky keyboard and a screen that flickered with a faint green tint. There was no biometric scanner here, no fingerprint reader, just a single narrow slot for a physical key. "The world thinks we run on the newest tech," the director whispered as Lena stepped forward. "But the most important secrets are kept on the things that can't be hacked from the outside. This is a closed-loop system. It hasn't been connected to the internet since 1994. Lena inserted the silver key. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. The green screen blinked to life. There were no graphics, just lines of text scrolling at a blistering speed. Lena's eyes tracked the data. She realized she wasn't looking at agency code anymore. She was looking at a digital diary, a record of a group that called themselves the Watchmen of the Perimeter. They weren't enemies, the director explained, leaning against the cold brick wall. They were the original architects of our national security. But they realized something early on, that power corrupts. They built a backdoor not to steal information, but to act as a fail-safe. If the agency ever became too arrogant, or if we grew too blind to see our own weaknesses, they would send a signal, a test. Lena looked at the green text. The symbol, the eye and the triangles. That was their signature. "Exactly," the director said. "For 30 years we've been looking for it. We've had thousands of analysts come through those doors. Some were brilliant, some were fast, but they all had one thing in common. They followed the rules. They trusted the automated filters. They ignored the small glitches because they were told the system was perfect." He looked at Lena with a strange kind of pride. "You're the first one who stopped. You're the first one who cared more about the truth than the protocol. By refusing to clear that check, you didn't just find a virus. You passed the audition." Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. What happens now? If the symbol is back, what are they testing us for? The director pointed to the screen. A new prompt had appeared. It was a single line of input. "Enter the missing pi. Enter the missing pi." "The file you caught in the main room was only half of the message," the director said. "The other half is hidden somewhere in this old machine." The watchman wanted to make sure that the person who found the signal was also capable of solving the puzzle. "If we don't provide the missing piece within the next hour, the failsafe will trigger. It will assume the agency has been compromised by people who don't care about the details, and it will shut us down. Forever." Lena sat on a dusty crate in front of the terminal. Her mind was racing. She wasn't thinking about her career anymore or the men who had mocked her. She was thinking about the logic of the people who built this. They were old school. They didn't believe in brute force. They believed in elegance and observation. She began to type. She didn't use the agency's modern commands. She used the older languages she had studied out of curiosity when she was a teenager, Fortran and Sobol. She searched the directories of the old machine, looking for anything that felt out of place. For 30 minutes, the only sound was the clicking of the mechanical keys. The director stayed silent, watching her work. He didn't offer advice. He knew he couldn't help her here. This was a bridge only she could cross. Lena found it hidden in an old maintenance log from 1988. It was a poem, buried in the comments of a power distribution script. It was a simple 4-line verse about a lighthouse keeper who watches the sea, not for ships, but for the light of other lighthouses. "The missing piece isn't code," Lena whispered, her eyes widening. "It's a philosophy." She realized the symbol, the eye in the triangle, represented 3 pillars: observation, skepticism, and responsibility. The missing piece was the 4th pillar that completed the square. She looked at the prompt again. Enter the missing piece. She thought about how Robert and Jackson had acted. They had the first 3 they observed the data. They were skeptical of her, and they felt they were being responsible by keeping the workflow moving. But they were missing the most important part. They were missing the human element. They had lost the ability to admit they might be wrong. Lena typed a single word into the prompt: humility. She held her breath and pressed enter. The green screen went dark. For a terrifying 10 seconds, nothing happened. Lena wondered if she had just ended her career and deleted the agency's history in one keystroke. The director tensed up beside her, his hand moving toward his radio. Then the terminal let out a long, high-pitched beep. The screen flickered back to life, but the green tint was gone. It was a clear, crisp white. The violet eye from her other monitor appeared on this screen too. But this time, it wasn't pulsing with a warning. It was steady. Beneath it, a new message appeared in plain English. "The perimeter is searcher. The caper has been found." Suddenly, the director's radio exploded with noise. "Sir, this is the main floor. The category purple anomaly has vanished. The servers are back to 100% capacity and, sir, you're not going to believe this, but the data flow is 10 times faster than it was before. It's like the system just cleared its own throat." The director smiled a real, genuine smile. He looked at Lena and exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for decades. "You did it," he said. "You didn't just stop a shutdown. You unlocked the original optimizations. You've given this place its soul back." Lena leaned back against the wall, her heart finally slowing down. She felt exhausted, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "So, am I still a rookie?" she asked, a small spark of wit returning to her voice. The director laughed and pulled the silver key from the slot, handing it back to her. "As of right now, you're the head of the Watchman protocol. You'll have your own office, your own team, and you'll never have to run a routine scrub again." He started to lead her back to the main room, but he paused at the door. "But remember, Lena, the test wasn't just for today. The Watchmen are always watching. Don't ever become a Robert." Lena nodded, tucking the silver key into her pocket. As they walked back into the main data wing, the silence that had greeted her earlier was gone. The analysts were whispering, pointing, and looking at her with a mix of awe and fear. But Lena didn't care about their stares. She looked at Terminal 14, where her old sweater was still draped over the chair, and she knew that the girl who had sat there this morning was gone. The following morning, the atmosphere in the agency had shifted completely. When Lena walked through the glass doors, the security guards didn't just glance at her badge, they stood a little straighter. The news of what had happened at Terminal 14 had spread through the building like a wildfire. She wasn't the quiet girl in the oversized sweater anymore. She was the person who had seen something the machines couldn't. Her new office was on the top floor, a space with actual windows that looked out over the city. It was a far cry from the chilly, windowless bunker of the server farm. On her desk sat a sleek, custom-built terminal, and a small, handwritten note from the director that simply read, "Keep looking." Lena sat down and looked at the silver key resting next to her keyboard. She felt a heavy sense of responsibility. Being the head of the Watchman protocol sounded prestigious, but she knew it meant she was now the last line of defense. If something small slipped past her, there was no one left to catch it. She spent the first few hours of her day familiarizing herself with the new system. It was incredible. The Watchman layer of the network was like a transparent map laid over the agency's regular data. She could see everything: the flow of emails, the encrypted pings from overseas satellites, and the tiny, rhythmic pulses of the heartbeat she had saved the day before. Around noon, a knock came at her door. It wasn't the director. Standing there was a young man, perhaps a few years older than Lena, wearing a frantic expression and a wrinkled lab coat. "Are you the one?" he asked, not even waiting for an invitation to enter. "The one who found the violet sigil." Lena nodded slowly. "I'm Lena. Can I help you?" The man stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "My name is David. I work in the Signal Intelligence Wing. 3 floors down. We've been monitoring a deep space transmission for 6 months. It's mostly static, or so we thought. But about an hour ago, right after you unlocked the legacy system, the static changed." He placed a tablet on her desk. On it was a waveform, a jagged line of blue light. It looked normal at first, but as Lena zoomed in, she saw it. Every few seconds, the wave would flatten into a perfect, straight line for exactly 1 millisecond. "It's a gap," Lena whispered. "Exactly," David said, his voice dropping. "A gap that occurs with perfect mathematical precision. We tried to run it through the main filters, but the system keeps ignoring it. It says the data is 100% consistent, but my gut is telling me the system is being told to lie." Lena felt that familiar spark of intuition. She looked at the silver key. "The system isn't lying, David. It's being bypassed. Someone is using the same handshake I found yesterday to hide a message inside the static." She stood up and moved to her new terminal. "Let's see if the Watchman layer can see what the agency is missing." Lena began to work. She didn't feel the nervousness she had felt the day before. The mockery of people like Robert had been a weight, but now that the weight was gone, she felt light and fast. She used the silver key to authorize a deep scan of the frequency David had provided. As the scan ran, she and David talked. She learned that he had been sidelined for months because he kept insisting that the static wasn't random. Like her, he had been told he was overthinking things. Like her, he had been mocked for trusting his instincts over the $40 million filters. "They want us to be parts of a machine," David said, looking out the window. "But machines don't solve problems. They just follow instructions." The terminal let out a soft chime. The scan was complete. The blue waveform on the screen split apart. Beneath the static, a hidden layer of data emerged. It wasn't a code this time. It was a series of coordinates. They pointed to a location only a few miles away, an old, abandoned radio observatory on the outskirts of the city. But that wasn't the part that made Lena's blood run cold. Alongside the coordinates was a live feed of a security camera. It showed a hallway. Lena recognized the carpet, the lighting, and the specific grain of the wood on the doors. "That's here," David gasped. "That's the 3rd floor, right outside my lab." On the screen, a figure appeared in the hallway. The person was wearing a maintenance uniform and carrying a toolkit. They stopped in front of a restricted access panel, the one that controlled the cooling for the main server farm. The figure looked up at the camera and smiled. It was Jackson. The man who had been reassigned to the archives wasn't in the archives. He was at a critical junction of the building's infrastructure, and he was holding a device that didn't look like any tool Lena had ever seen. "He's not just angry about his job," Lena said, her fingers flying across the keys to alert security. He was part of it. He was the one who was supposed to clear the check yesterday. When I refused to do it, I ruined a plan that had been in motion for years. She realized then that the test from the watchman wasn't just a riddle, it was a warning. The violet symbol hadn't appeared because it was time for a promotion. It appeared because the agency was already being eaten from the inside. Security is 5 minutes away, Lena said, grabbing her coat. The director is in a meeting in the clean room. He's unreachable. If Jackson opens that panel, he can flood the server room with fire-suppressant gas. It'll kill the hardware and anyone inside. We can't wait for security, David said, his face pale. Lena looked at the silver key in her hand. She realized that the humility she had typed into the computer wasn't just about admitting mistakes. It was about realizing that sometimes you have to be the one to act, even when you're afraid. Come on, Lena said, heading for the door. We're the only ones who know he's there. They ran for the stairs, avoiding the elevators. As they descended, Lena's mind worked through the puzzle. Why would Jackson do this? He had been at the agency for years, but then she remembered the way he had talked, the bitterness, the sense of being passed over by a world that was moving too fast for him. He didn't want to protect the agency. He wanted to rule it, or destroy it. They reached the 3rd floor, bursting through the stairwell door. The hallway was long and silent. At the far end, they saw him. Jackson was kneeling by the access panel, his toolkit open. He had a laptop hooked into the building's nervous system. "Jackson, stop!" Lena shouted. The man spun around. The smug, joking version of Jackson was gone. His eyes were wide and desperate. "You should have stayed in the basement, kid," he spat. "You think you're a hero because you found a fancy symbol? You have no idea what's coming. This place is a tomb. I'm just turning out the lights." He reached for a large red switch on his device. "If you do that, the Watchman protocol will lock you in this hallway," Lena said, her voice echoing with a confidence she didn't know she possessed. "I've already isolated this sector. You aren't just shutting down the servers. You're trapping yourself in the blast zone." It was a bluff. She hadn't had time to isolate the sector yet, but Jackson didn't know that. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the switch. In that second of hesitation, David lunged forward, tackling Jackson away from the panel. The two men crashed into the wall, the laptop sliding across the floor. Lena ran to the panel. The screen on Jackson's device was counting down. 10 seconds to gas release. She didn't have her terminal. She didn't have her custom scripts. She only had the silver key, and her knowledge of the old ways. She saw a small, manual override slot at the bottom of the digital lock. It was shaped exactly like the key in her hand. She jammed the silver key into the slot and turned it hard to the left. The countdown froze at 02. The hum of the cooling fans, which had begun to scream, settled back into a steady drone. A moment later, the sound of heavy boots filled the hallway as the security team finally arrived. They swarmed over Jackson, pinning him to the floor. The director appeared a moment later, breathless. He looked at the scene. The tackled man. The override panel. And Lena standing there with her hand still on the silver key. He didn't ask what happened. He looked at the panel and saw the key override light glowing green. "I told you," the director said, looking at Lena with profound respect. "The watchmen are always watching, but they don't do the work. The keeper does." As they led Jackson away, Lena looked at David. He was dusting off his lab coat, looking a bit shocked but proud. "I think," Lena said, "we're going to need a bigger team." But as the excitement died down, Lena looked at the laptop Jackson had been using. The screen was still on. On it, the violet eye was flashing, but this time, it was surrounded by a circle of other symbols she hadn't seen yet. The warning wasn't over. Jackson was just a pawn. The aftermath of the hallway confrontation felt heavy. While the rest of the agency celebrated the capture of a traitor, Lena sat in her top-floor office, the door locked and the blinds drawn. On her desk, Jackson's confiscated laptop was connected to her secure terminal. The violet eye was no longer alone on the screen. It was now the center of a constellation of 12 different symbols, each one pulsing with a different color. David sat in the chair across from her, a cup of coffee forgotten in his hand. He hadn't left her side since the incident on the third floor. Together, they looked at the map of symbols. It looked less like a computer virus and more like a star chart. "It's a network," David whispered. Jackson wasn't just working for himself. Look at the pings. Lena traced the digital trails. Each symbol represented a different hub. One was in a major bank in London. Another was in a power grid control center in Tokyo. A third was in a satellite array in the Brazilian rainforest. These weren't just random targets. They were the pillars of the modern world. The Watchmen didn't build this to destroy things, Lena realized, her voice trembling slightly. They built it to connect them. But Jackson and whoever he was working for, they were trying to use the connection to pull the plug on everything at once. A global reset. She saw a final countdown timer at the bottom of the map. It wasn't counting down to a gas leak or a server crash anymore. It was counting down to a synchronization event. They had exactly 40 minutes before every one of those 12 hubs was triggered. "If those hubs go dark," David said, "it's not just about data. It's hospitals, air traffic control, water filtration. It'll be chaos." Lena knew she couldn't call the director for this. By the time the bureaucracy moved, by the time they cleared the legal hurdles to access international servers, the world would already be in the dark. This was why the Watchman Protocol existed. It was for the moments when the rules became the obstacle. "I have to go inside," Lena said. "What do you mean?" David asked. "The only way to stop a synchronized event is to be at the center of the clock," she explained. She picked up the silver key. "This key isn't just a physical override. It's a master credential. I have to upload myself into the bridge and manually decouple the hubs." She looked at David. "I need you to stay here. If the system starts to overheat, you have to use the manual cooling vents. Don't let my terminal shut down, no matter what. If I lose the connection while I'm in there, I won't be able to get back out of the encrypted layer." David nodded, his face setting into a look of grim determination. "I've got the vents. Just do what you do best. Be the person who sees what the rest of us miss." Lena took a deep breath and plugged the silver key into her main terminal. She put on her headset and closed her eyes. The world of the office faded away, replaced by the rhythmic hum of the digital bridge. In her mind's eye, the code wasn't just text anymore. It was a landscape. She saw the 12 pillars of light stretching into the dark, all connected by thin, violet threads. She began to move through the data, her fingers flying across the keys in the physical world while her mind navigated the digital maze. The first pillar, the London Bank, was easy. She used the humility protocol to bypass the aggressive firewalls, convincing the system that she wasn't an intruder but a guardian. The thread snapped, and the pillar turned from a threatening red to a calm, steady blue. The second, third, and fourth pillars followed. But as she reached the halfway point, the system began to fight back. The Watchman code was designed to be difficult. It was testing her again. Every time she reached for a thread, the landscape shifted. The temperature in the office began to rise. She could hear the fans in her terminal screaming as the processor struggled to keep up with the complexity of the global map. "Lena, the hardware is hitting 90 degrees. David's voice came through her headset, sounding far away. I'm opening the vents, but the agency's main power is trying to throttle your office. They think there's a malfunction. Keep it open, David, Lena shouted. She was at the ninth pillar, the power grid. This one was different. It wasn't just code. It was a mirror. To decouple it, she had to solve a puzzle that used her own personal history. The screen flashed images of her first day, the insults from Robert, the moments she had almost given up and walked out. The system was asking her, why do you protect a world that didn't want you? Lena didn't hesitate. She typed her answer directly into the core of the pillar. Because the world isn't the people who mock me. It's the people who need me to be right. The ninth pillar turned blue. 10 minutes left. 2 pillars remained. The office was now incredibly hot. Lena could feel the sweat stinging her eyes, but she couldn't move her hands to wipe them. The 11th pillar was the satellite array. It was the most complex, a swirling vortex of encrypted signals. Lena felt her energy flagging. The mental strain of holding the global network in her head was becoming too much. She felt like she was trying to hold back an ocean with a sheet of glass. Suddenly, a new voice entered her headset. It wasn't David. It was a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices layered over each other, old, wise, and slightly metallic. You are tired, Keeper, the voice said. You have done more than any who came before you. You can stop now. Let the reset happen. The world that comes after will be cleaner, simpler. No, Lena whispered. Complexity is where life happens. We don't get to decide when it's over just because it's messy. Then show us the final truth, the voice replied. The 12th pillar appeared. It wasn't a bank or a grid. It was a mirror of the agency itself. To stop the final synchronization, Lena had to delete the Watchman protocol itself. She had to give up the power she had just gained. To save the world, she had to go back to being a nobody. She looked at the silver key. If she did this, the key would become useless. She would lose her office, her status, and the director's protection. She would just be a junior analyst again, sitting at a desk, checking packets. She didn't even stop to think. She entered the command to dissolve the bridge. Delete protocol. Watchman? Confirm? Confirm, Lena said. She hit the enter key with the last of her strength. The world exploded into white light. The hum in her ears vanished. The heat in the room dissipated instantly. Lena opened her eyes. She was slumped in her chair. The office was silent. The windows showed a city that was still glowing with lights. The power was on. The windows showed a city that was still glowing with lights. The power was on. The planes were flying, and the water was flowing. The 12 pillars were gone. David was standing by the server rack, his face covered in soot, but wearing a massive grin. You did it. The synchronization stopped. Everything is back to normal. Lena looked at her monitor. The custom interface was gone. It was just a standard, boring agency login screen. She pulled the silver key from the slot. It felt lighter now, just a piece of metal with no magic left in it. A few minutes later, the director walked in. He looked at the standard screen, then at the key in Lena's hand. He saw the sweat on her face and the exhaustion in her eyes. He knew exactly what she had given up. The network is gone, the director said softly. The agency is just an agency again. We're on our own now. That's how it should be, Lena said, standing up on shaky legs. We shouldn't need a secret society to tell us to do the right thing. The director walked over and took the silver key from her. He looked at it for a long time, then he dropped it into a heavy metal shredder by the door. The machine whirred and the missing piece was gone forever. You're right, the director said. But we still need people who can see the symbols in the static. He didn't give her a promotion. He didn't give her a medal. Instead, he handed her a small, laminated badge. It didn't have a title or a rank. It just had her name and a single, small violet dot in the corner. Go home and get some sleep, the director said. You have a lot of work to do tomorrow. There's a new batch of junior analysts starting on Monday, and they're going to need someone to teach them how to look at the world. Lena walked out of the office and down to the lobby. As she passed the server room on the way to the exit, she saw a new group of technicians working at Terminal 14. They were complaining about a slow connection and joking about the glitchy software. Lena smiled to herself and kept walking. She stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. She was a nobody again, and for the first time in her life she realized that being a nobody was the most powerful thing she could be. Because a nobody is the only one who is truly free to do what's right when everyone else is looking the other way. The world was safe, not because of a machine or a myth, but because one girl had refused to click a button.